Welcome to the Perception series. This video is about high-level visual processing. The images project onto the retina are generally complex dynamic patterns of the light of varying intensity and color. As we have discussed, low-level visual processing is responsible for the detection of various types of contrast in these images. Intermediate level visual processing is involved in the identification, so-called visual primitives. High-level visual processing integrates information from a variety of sources and is final stage in the visual pathway leading to conscious visual experience. In practice, high-level visual processing depends on top-down signals that are full of bottom-up sensory representations with semantic significance, such as that arising from short-term working memory, long-term memory, and behavior goals. High-level visual processing thus selects behaviorally meaningful attributes of the visual environment. Our visual experience of the world is fundamentally object-centered. Objects are often visually complex, composed of a large number of conjoined visual features. They are commonly associated with specific experience, other remembered object, other sensations such as the hum of the coffee grinder or aroma of lover's perfume, and various emotion. In conjunction with our own behavior goals, it is the behavioral saliency of individual objects, memories, and emotional valences, as well as the real or implied actions of others that enable us to take action based on visual information. Object perception is thus the nexus between vision and cognition. The temporal lobe is a site of convergence of many types of visual information because the hierarchy of synaptic relays in the cortical visual system extends from the primary visual cortex to the temporal lobe. The visual signal originating in the retina are proceed in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus before reaching the primary visual cortex. Thereafter, ascending visual pathways follow two parallel and hierarchically originated streams, the ventral and dorsal streams. Here, we are interested in the ventral streams. The ventral streams extend ventrally and anteriorly from V1 through V2, V4, and the temporal occipital junction before reaching the inferior temporal cortex. This pathway makes the inferior temporal cortex the seat of the highest stage of cortical visual processing. Therefore, inferior temporal neurons are in a position to integrate a large and diverse quantity of visual information over a huge region of visual space. Until 19th century, people thought impairment of object recognition originated from the visual cortex, but neurologists couldn't find any reasons on the visual cortex. Therefore, it was called psychic blindness at that time. However, neurologists and psychologists in the late 19th century found that object recognition impairment is from temporal lobe lesions. So the term psychic blindness was later replaced by Sigmund Freud with visual agnosia, means without visual knowledge. In humans, there are two basic categories of visual agnosia: apperceptive and associative. With apperceptive agnosia, the ability to match or copy complex visual shape or objects is impaired. This impairment is perceptual in nature, resulting from disruption of the first stage of object recognition, which is the integration of visual features into sensory representation of entire objects. Associative agnosia, in contrast, can match or copy complex objects, but the ability to identify the object is impaired. This impairment results from disruption of the second stage of the objective recognition, which is association of the sensory representation of an object with knowledge of the object's meaning or function. Consistent with this functional hierarchy, the integration of visual features and object identification, apperceptive agnosia is most common following damage to posterior inferior temporal cortex, whereas associative agnosia is a higher order perceptual deficit is more common following damage to the anterior inferior temporal cortex, the latter stage in the functional hierarchy. Neurons in the temporal lobe are relatively insensitive to simple stimulus features such as the orientation and color. Instead, they have large and centrally located receptive field and encode complex stimulus features. Therefore, some small populations of neurons here might encode different features of the objects. For example, several small subpopulations of neurons encode objects that convey to the observer highly meaningful information, such as faces and hands. Damage to small regions in the temporal lobe result in an inability to recognize faces, a form of associative agnosia known as prosopagnosia. Patients with prosopagnosia can identify a face as a face, recognize its parts, and even detect specific emotion expressed by the face. But they are unable to identify a particular face as belonging to a specific person. Prosopagnosia is one example for category-specific agnosia, in which patients are temporal lobe damaged fail to recognize items with a specific semantic category. Early relays in the cortical system are organized in columns of neurons that represent the same stimulus features such as orientation or direction of motion in different parts of visual field. Cells within inferior temporal cortex are also originate in columns of neurons representing the same or similar stimulus properties. Object recognition is intimately intertwined with visual categorization, visual memory, and emotion, and the outputs of the inferior temporal cortex contribute to these functions. Among the principal projections are those to the perihindal and parahippocampal cortices, which lie medially adjacent to the ventral surface of the inferior temporal cortex. These regions project in turn to the anterolateral cortex and the hippocampal formation, both of which are involved in long-term memory storage and retrieval. A second major projection is from the interior temporal cortex to the prefrontal cortex, which increasingly recognized as an important contributor to high-level vision. The ability to recognize objects as the same under different viewing conditions is one of the most functionally important requirements of visual experience. The invariant attributes of an object are cues to the identity and meaning of the object. For example, the spatial and chromatic relationship between image features or characteristic features such as the stripes of zebra are cue to the identity and meaning of the object. For object recognition to take place, these invariant attributes must be represented independently of other image properties. The visual system does this with proficiently, and its behavior manifestation is termed perceptual constancy. Perceptual constancy has many forms ranging from invariance across simple transformation of an object such as size, position, and rotation to the sameness of objects within a common category. All forms of perceptual constancy are product of the visual system attempts to generalize across different retinal images generated by a single object. A more general constancy is the perception of the individual objects as belonging to the same semantic category. Categorical perception is classically defined by ability to distinguish objects of different categories even when objects of the same category cannot be distinguished. Categorical perception simplifies behavior. For example, it usually does not matter whether an apple is completely spherical or slightly morted on the left side, or whether the chair we are offered is an office chair or other chairs. Similarly, reading ability requires one to recognize the alphabet in the broad variety of styles. Like the simpler forms of perceptual constancy, categorical perception reflects sensitivity to invariant visual attributes. Visual experience can be stored as memory, and the visual memory influences processing of incoming visual information. Object recognition, in particular, relies on the observer's previous experience with objects. Thus, the contribution of the inferior temporal cortex to object recognition must be modifiable by experience. As I just said, the ability to resolve differences between complex visual stimuli is highly modifiable by experience. For example, individuals who attend to and examine fine differences between different models of smartphone become far better at discriminating and recognizing such differences. Similarly, when one has experience with novel objects formed from simple feature, inferior temporal neurons become selective for these objects. Sharpening is precisely the sort of neural change that could underline improvements in perceptual discrimination of visual stimuli. Progress has been made in understanding the interaction between vision and memory, specifically in relation to two issues. First, how is visual sensory information maintained in short-term working memory? Working memory has a limited capacity, acting like a buffer in a computer operating system. Also, it is susceptible to interference as when trying to remember the face of a person you have just met. Second, how are long-term visual memories and the association between them stored and recalled? Visual neurons in both the inferior temporal and prefrontal cortices continue firing during the delay in a visual delayed response task. This delay period activity is true to maintain information in short-term working memory. Delay period activity in the inferior temporal and prefrontal cortices differs in several ways. For one, the activity in the inferior temporal cortex is associated with the short-term storage of visual patterns and color information, whereas the activity in the prefrontal cortex encodes not only visual spatial information, but also information about other sensory modalities. Delay period activity in the inferior temporal cortex also appears to be closely attuned to visual experience, for it encodes the sample image and can be eliminated by the appearance of another image. In the prefrontal cortex, by contrast, delay period activity is more likely to depend on task requirements and is not terminated by later sensory inputs, suggesting that it may play a role in the recall of long-term memories. During the delay, the subject could remember the sample object by retaining a sensory code or thinking ahead to the expected objects using a prospective coding. Neurons in the prefrontal cortex initially encode the sensory properties of the sample object but later begin to encode the expected object. Therefore, prospective coding in the prefrontal cortex may be the source of top-down signals to the inferior temporal cortex, activating neurons that represent the expected object and thus giving rise to a conscious recall of that object. Here is experimental evidence. Objects that have been paired elicit similar neural responses as functional connection had been enhanced. However, responses elicited by unpaired objects are unrelated. This pattern of selectivity was temporally and conditionally tied to learning. That is, the changes in the neural activity occurred on the same timescale as the behavior changes and were dependent on successful learning. The learning-dependent changes in the stimulus selectivity of inferior temporal cortex neurons are long-lasting, suggesting that this cortical region is part of the neural circuitry for visual associative memory. Let's talk a bit more about the recall. The sensory experience of an image in one's visual field that the recall the same image are subjectively similar. Former depends on bottom-top flow of visual information and is what we traditionally regard as a vision. The latter, by contrast, is a product of top-down information flow. This distinction is anatomically accurate but obscures the fact that under normal conditions, afferent and descending signal collaborate to yield visual experience. Visual associative memories are stored in the visual cortex through changes in the functional connectivity between neurons that independently represent the associative stimuli. The practical consequence of this change is that a neuron that responds only to stimulus A prior to learning will respond to both stimulus A and stimulus B after these stimuli have been associated. Activation of a responsive neuron by the associative stimulus B can be viewed as the neural correlate of top-down recall of stimulus A. Although learned association between images are likely to be stored through circuit change in the inferior temporal cortex, the prefrontal cortex is essential for activating these circuits for conscious recall. The inferior temporal cortex might receive the afferent signal for one of a pair of images and relay to the prefrontal cortex, where the information would be maintained in working memory. Signals from the prefrontal cortex to the inferior temporal cortex would selectively activate neurons representing the associated image, and that activation would constitute visual recall. The eminent neuropsychologist Hans Lukas Teuber once wrote that failure of object recognition would appear in its purest form as a normal percept that has somehow been stripped of its meaning. Indeed, the assignment of meaning is one of the most important processes in vision and forms the core of high-level visual processing. Okay, this was about high-level visual processing. You might realize that we only focusing on object recognition, the ventral pathway. But the visual system involves more than just object recognition. So, in the next video, we will talk about attention and action, the dorsal pathway. See you then.